My name is Eliza Hart, and I'm 37 years old. 7 weeks ago, I woke up in an intensive care room with half my head shaved, a bandage wrapped tight around my skull, and the taste of metal and medicine sitting thick on my tongue. For a few terrifying seconds, I didn't remember where I was. The lights above me were too bright, the machines beside me beeped steadily, and every tiny movement sent a deep, pulsing pain through my head, like someone had cracked my skull open and poured fire behind my eyes. A nurse leaned over me and told me the surgery had gone well, that I was safe, that I needed to stay calm. Safe. That word almost makes me laugh now, because while doctors had been fighting to keep me alive, my own family had been stripping my life down to the foundation. The nurse placed my phone beside my hand and said my family had been calling. At first, my heart jumped with fear. 62 missed calls, 31 text messages, 4 voicemails. I thought someone had died. I thought maybe my parents had finally realized they nearly lost their daughter and were panicking with guilt. I thought maybe my younger brother Jason had called to apologize for missing my surgery, or at least to ask if I was still breathing. That was the last soft thought I allowed myself to have about them. With shaking fingers, I opened the first voicemail. It was from my father, and his voice was calm, almost gentle, the same voice he used when explaining why I needed to be reasonable, while everyone else took what they wanted. "Eliza, sweetheart, don't panic," he said. "We handled something for you while you were unavailable. Your studio building has been transferred to a buyer. The money is going toward Jason's campaign gala. This is bigger than you. Your brother has a real future." I listened once, then again, then a third time, because my brain, swollen and drugged and stitched together, refused to accept the meaning of those words. My studio building. Harbor Kiln. The old brick warehouse by the docks that I had bought 12 years earlier when everyone else called it a dump. The place where the roof leaked so badly I used buckets during my first winter. The place where I slept on an air mattress in the back office because I couldn't afford rent and renovations at the same time. The place where I taught nervous beginners how to center clay, where tourists came in from the rain to buy mugs still warm from the kiln, where I had painted the front door blue with my own hands because I wanted one bright thing against the fog. They had sold it, while surgeons were inside my skull, while I was unconscious and helpless. And they had done it for Jason. Of course they had. Jason Hart, 30 years old, my parents' golden child, the man who had never finished anything except spending other people's money, had decided he was going to run for mayor of Astoria. He had no experience, no plan, and no understanding of city government beyond the belief that smiling in a Navy suit made him look trustworthy. But my parents saw greatness in him. They always had. When he failed, he was misunderstood. When I succeeded, I was lucky. When he needed money, it was an investment. When I needed support, I was dramatic. Growing up, my mother used to say, "Eliza is strong. Jason is sensitive." It sounded harmless when I was a child, but as I got older, I understood what it really meant. Sensitive meant Jason could break things and someone else would clean up the glass. Strong meant I could bleed quietly and no one had to notice. The week before my surgery, they had invited me to dinner at their waterfront house on Seabreeze Lane, pretending it was concern. My mother served salmon, my father poured wine, and Jason arrived 40 minutes late, wearing campaign merchandise with his own name on it. They waited until dessert to ask me for money. Not a small amount. Not help with printing signs or renting chairs. They wanted me to refinance Harbor Kiln to fund Jason's campaign launch gala at the Columbia River Maritime Hall, a glass-walled venue overlooking the water, with champagne towers, donors, reporters, and a banner that was supposed to introduce Jason as a new tide for Astoria. I told them no. I said Harbor Kiln was my business, my livelihood, my home in every way that mattered. My father's mouth tightened. My mother looked wounded, as if my refusal were a betrayal instead of a boundary. Jason leaned back in his chair and said, "You never believed in me." I remember staring at him across the table, at the perfect son who had been handed cars, rent money, second chances, and excuses, and I said, "Belief is not a business plan." My mother slapped her napkin onto the table and told me I was jealous. That was their favorite word for me. Jealous, bitter, selfish, difficult, Anything to avoid calling me what I actually was, the person they used when love stopped being enough to cover the bills. I left that night angry, but not afraid. That was my mistake. I thought saying no meant the conversation was over. I didn't know they had already decided my no didn't matter. 3 weeks later, I collapsed in Harbor Kiln while loading a kiln shelf. The pain came out of nowhere, a blinding explosion behind my left eye, and the last thing I remembered was a student screaming my name as the concrete floor rushed toward me. At the hospital, a doctor told me I had a bleeding aneurysm and needed surgery immediately. I called my mother from the emergency room. She sounded annoyed when she answered because they were meeting Jason's campaign photographer. When I told her I might need brain surgery, there was one breath of silence, one tiny opening where a real mother might have appeared. Then she said, "Tonight? But Jason's donor dinner is tonight." I should have understood then. Maybe some part of me did. Still, before the nurse took my phone, I whispered, "I'm scared." My mother said, "Don't be dramatic, Eliza. You're always so strong." Then they wheeled me away. None of them came. Not my mother, not my father, not Jason. And when I woke up 11 hours later, they hadn't called to ask if I survived. They had called because they wanted to make sure I knew they had won. I lay in that hospital bed, unable to lift my head, listening to my father's voicemail until every word carved itself into me. Transferred. Buyer. Campaign gala. Bigger than you. Your brother has a real future. Bigger than me. My life's work was apparently smaller than one night of applause for Jason. My survival was less urgent than a ballroom full of donors. My signature, my consent, my ownership, my body on an operating table, none of it mattered to them. The nurse asked if I needed more pain medication. I said no. The pain in my head was nothing compared to the cold, clear thing forming in my chest. For 37 years, I had begged silently to be seen by people who only looked at me when they needed something. I had mistaken endurance for love. I had mistaken usefulness for belonging. But lying there with stitches in my scalp and my studio stolen, I finally saw my family exactly as they were. They had not forgotten to love me. They had chosen not to. And the moment I understood that, I stopped crying for what I had lost and started thinking about what they didn't know. Because 5 years earlier, when my parents were about to lose their precious Seabreeze house to foreclosure, someone had saved them through a quiet little company called Gray Lantern Holdings. They never knew who owned that company. They never knew who had let them stay. They never knew that every month, when they paid rent to what they thought was a faceless investor, they were paying me. I had saved their home because I still loved them then. But love has a limit. Mine had just been reached. So with my hand trembling against the bedsheet, I made one phone call. Not to my parents, not to Jason, but to my attorney, Marina Val. When she answered, I said, "They sold Harbor Kiln." She was silent for 1 second, then said, "I'm coming." And as I closed my eyes against the hospital lights, I knew one thing with perfect certainty. Jason's campaign gala was in 16 days, and if my family wanted an audience, I was going to give them one. Marina Valley arrived at my hospital room the next afternoon looking like she had walked straight out of a courtroom and into a crime scene. She wore a charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled into a low knot, and she carried 2 folders pressed against her chest like weapons. I had known Marina for almost 13 years, since the first week I decided to buy the old warehouse that became Harbor Kiln. Back then, she had warned me the building was a disaster, that the inspection report read like a horror novel, and that most people with sense would run. When I told her I still wanted it, she studied me for a long moment and said, "Then we'll make sure no one can take it from you." I remembered those words when she stepped into my hospital room and closed the door behind her. "Don't sit up," she said before I could try. "You look like you fought a train, and the train cheated." I would have laughed if my skull hadn't felt like glass. She placed the folders on the rolling table beside my bed and pulled up a chair. For a moment, she didn't speak. She looked at the bandage around my head, the bruises blooming along my arms from IVs, the monitors, the wires, the evidence that I had been completely defenseless when my family made their move. Her expression hardened in a way I had only seen once before, when a landlord tried to illegally evict one of her elderly clients. "I pulled the transfer documents," she said. "Eliza, what they did is not just wrong. It's criminal. I stared at the ceiling because looking at her made it too real. Tell me. She opened the first folder. They used a medical power of attorney dated 2 days before your surgery. It claims you authorized your father to manage your property and business affairs in the event of incapacity. I turned my head slowly. I never signed anything like that. I know. She slid a photocopy toward me, though I could barely focus on it. This signature is a bad imitation. The loops are wrong, the pressure is wrong, and whoever wrote it didn't even spell your middle name correctly on one page. A strange laugh escaped me, dry and ugly. They forged my signature and still couldn't be bothered to know my middle name. Marina's mouth tightened. The witness is Earl Matson. I closed my eyes. Earl was my father's fishing buddy, a man who smelled permanently of beer and bait, and once told me women became unpleasant when they earned too much. Of course it is. The notary stamp is worse, Marina continued. The woman whose stamp appears on this document moved to Idaho 2 years ago. Her commission in Oregon expired before this was supposedly signed. Either someone duplicated her stamp, or your father found an old impression and reused it. Can we get Harbor Kiln back? I asked, and the question came out smaller than I wanted. For the first time, Marina hesitated. We can fight. We can file an emergency injunction, challenge the transfer, freeze funds, and pursue criminal charges. The buyer is claiming they acted in good faith, but the rushed closing, the bad notary, the timing during surgery, there are enough red flags that a judge will pay attention. But it may take time. Time. That word felt cruel. Time was what they had stolen too. 12 years of it. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. Where did the money go? Marina opened the second folder. Most of it was wired into an account controlled by your father. From there, large payments went to event vendors connected to Jason's campaign launch. Venue deposit, catering, production company, public relations consultant, security, luxury transportation. She looked up at me. There are also transfers directly to Jason's campaign committee that may violate reporting rules. I pictured Jason on stage beneath his stupid campaign banner, smiling with teeth paid for by my stolen life. He knew. I can't prove that yet. He knew, I said again. Marina didn't argue. She simply closed the folder and placed one hand on top of it. There is another matter. I already knew what she meant before she said it, because the universe has a strange sense of timing. Seabreeze Lane, she nodded. Your parents' lease expires in 18 days. The room seemed to go quiet around us, even though the machines kept beeping and nurses moved in the hallway outside. Seabreeze Lane was my parents' pride, a cedar-sided waterfront house with a wraparound porch and big windows facing the marina. My mother liked to stand in that living room during parties and say things like, "We've been blessed," as if blessings came from heaven and not from daughters who paid debts in secret. 5 years earlier, that house had nearly been taken by the bank. Jason had convinced my father to pour their savings into a boat rental startup run by one of his friends, a man with perfect hair, no business license, and a talent for vanishing. Within months, the money was gone, the friend was gone, and the foreclosure notices started arriving. My mother called me sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "We'll lose everything," she said. "Your father can't sleep. Jason feels terrible. Please, Eliza, you're the only one who can help." I had sat on the floor of Harbor Kiln after that call, surrounded by clay dust and unpaid invoices, knowing I should let them face the consequences of their choices. But the child inside me, the girl who still wanted her mother to look at her with pride, picked up the phone and called Marina. We created Gray Lantern Holdings, bought the mortgage debt, and arranged a lease that let my parents stay at below market rent. They thought a faceless investment company had saved them. They never knew it was me. Every holiday I spent in that house afterward, every time my father criticized my clothes or my mother praised Jason for breathing, I sat there knowing I owned the roof over their heads and still said nothing. Not because I was weak, because I had loved them quietly, in the only language they seemed to understand, rescue. Now Marina watched my face carefully. You can choose not to renew. My fingers curled into the bedsheet. How long would they have? If we serve notice at expiration, they'll have the period required under the lease and local law. We will do it properly. No mistakes, no shortcuts. Prepare it. She exhaled slowly. Eliza, once you do this, They will call it revenge. I turned my head and looked at her fully, even though the movement made pain flare behind my eye. They sold my studio while doctors were cutting into my brain. They funded Jason's fake future with my real life. If they call consequences revenge, that's because they've never had to face any. Marina's eyes softened. I agree, but I need you to be sure. I was sure. More sure than I had ever been about anything. The gala is in 16 days, I said. They want donors, reporters, cameras, applause. They want a stage. Marina leaned back, understanding dawning across her face. Eliza? No, I whispered. They made this public when they used my business to fund a political event. They made it public when Jason built a campaign on stolen money. They made it public when my mother posted online that I was bitter because I wouldn't support him. My voice trembled, but not from doubt. I have been quiet my entire life, so they could stay comfortable. I'm done being quiet. That evening, Jason texted me. Not to ask whether I could see straight yet, not to ask if I remembered the surgery, not even to pretend concern. He wrote, "You need to stop making this a problem. The gala is too important." A minute later, another message appeared. Mom is devastated. Dad says you're threatening the family. Don't embarrass us. I stared at those words until they blurred. Then I screenshotted them. My mother posted on Facebook the next morning a glossy photo of Jason in a navy suit beside the river, with the caption, "So proud of our son, who has sacrificed so much for this community." Sadly, not everyone in our family knows how to celebrate another person's dream. Some people choose bitterness over love. Within hours, relatives began messaging me. Cousins I hadn't seen in years told me to stop being jealous. An aunt said Jason needed support more than I needed another little art project. A family friend wrote, "Your parents have done everything for you. Shame on you." Not one person asked why I was angry. Not one person asked how the surgery went. Not one person asked what had been taken from me. So I saved every message, every post, every cruel little sentence thrown by people who preferred a convenient lie to an uncomfortable truth. 2 days after I was discharged, I asked a friend to drive me past Harbor Kiln. I still had staples in my scalp and a warning from my doctor to avoid stress, which was almost funny by then. When we pulled up to the building, there was a chain across the front door and a printed notice taped to the glass. Property under new management. Tenant access restricted. Tenant. I had to press a hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. Through the window, I could see my pottery wheels covered in plastic, my shelves half empty, my unfinished bowls drying under cloth like abandoned bodies. A security guard came around the corner and told me I couldn't be there. I looked up at the camera above the door, then back at him. "Good," I said. "Make sure it's recording." By the morning of Jason's gala, Marina had everything ready. The forged power of attorney, the invalid notary record, the bank transfers, the emergency court filing, the ownership documents for Seabreeze Lane, and my father's voicemail. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my recovery apartment, looking at the shaved side of my head, the pale curve of my scar, the black dress hanging loose on my thinner frame. I didn't look powerful. I looked wounded. But wounds are evidence, and for once, I was going to let everyone see mine. Then I picked up the folder, walked out the door, and went to give my family exactly what they had always wanted. A night no one would ever forget. The Columbia River Maritime Hall looked like the kind of place where people paid a fortune to pretend they were humble. Glass walls rose 3 stories high over the dark water, chandeliers glittered like captured stars, and every table was covered in white linen, gold chargers, and little cards printed with Jason's campaign slogan, "A New Tide for Astoria." I stood at the entrance for a moment, one hand wrapped around the folder Marina had prepared, the other pressed lightly against the side of my head where the scar still burned beneath my hair. The room smelled of champagne, roses, and money. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling too brightly, laughing too loudly, shaking hands as if each palm held a promise. My brother stood near the stage in a navy suit, his teeth flashing for cameras, his campaign banner hanging behind him like a crown. My parents hovered beside him, my mother in silver silk, my father in a tuxedo he had no doubt paid for with money stolen from me. For one strange second, I saw us from far away, the golden sun, the proud parents, and the wounded daughter walking in from the edge of the room like a ghost nobody had expected to survive. My mother noticed me first. Her smile froze so suddenly it looked painful. She touched my father's sleeve, and he turned, his face darkening before he remembered where he was, and forced his mouth into something that almost looked like concern. Jason saw me a heartbeat later. His expression cracked, just for a second, and then he crossed the room quickly, weaving between donors with that polished politician stride he had practiced in the mirror. "Eliza," he said under his breath when he reached me, still smiling for the people watching. "What are you doing here?" I looked past him at the banner. "You invited the family. You shouldn't be out after surgery." That almost sounded like concern. His eyes dropped to the folder in my hand. "What is that?" "A gift." His jaw tightened. "Don't start. Not tonight." I tilted my head, and the movement sent a sharp pain behind my eye, but I refused to wince. "Tonight seems important." He leaned closer, his voice turning hard and ugly beneath the public smile. "If you embarrass me, I swear you'll regret it." Before I could answer, a photographer appeared and asked for a family photo. Jason's hand closed around my upper arm, too tight, possessive and warning. "Smile," he whispered. I looked down at his fingers, then back at him. "Take your hand off me." The photographer lowered the camera. My mother rushed over, laughing nervously, saying something about emotions running high after my surgery, and my father stepped in front of me like he could block the truth with his body. "Eliza," he murmured, "whatever you think happened, this is not the place." I stared at him. "You're right. A hospital bed would have been better, but you made your choice there." His face went red. My mother's eyes filled with tears on command. "Please," she whispered, "your brother has worked so hard." I almost laughed. Hard work. I thought of the locked doors at Harbor Kiln, the chains across the entrance, my pottery wheels covered in plastic, my life treated like abandoned property. "So have I said, and walked past them to my assigned table near the back wall, beside a speaker and a potted fern, as far from the stage as family could be placed without being left outside. Marina arrived 15 minutes later, calm as winter, wearing a dark green suit and carrying her own folder. She sat beside me without greeting anyone and whispered, "Only speak to facts. Let them react. Don't chase them into emotion." I nodded. The dinner was expensive enough to make me sick. Salmon with citrus glaze, tiny towers of crab, imported wine, desserts arranged like sculptures. Jason moved from table to table, charming donors, squeezing shoulders, promising transparency, integrity, service. Every word scraped against my nerves. At 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed, and Jason stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. My parents sat at the front table, glowing. He began with a joke about rain, then spoke about community, sacrifice, and leadership. He thanked his campaign team. He thanked the donors. Then he thanked my parents for teaching him the meaning of family. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. My father lifted his chin proudly. Then Jason turned his gaze toward the back of the room, directly at me. "And tonight, I want to acknowledge someone very special," he said. "My sister, Eliza, who is here after a serious medical emergency. She's had a difficult few weeks, but she taught me resilience. Eliza, would you come say a few words?" The room erupted in polite applause. It was beautifully done. If I refused, I looked bitter. If I walked up and praised him, he owned the narrative. Jason smiled down at me like he had already won. Marina's hand brushed my wrist once. I stood slowly. The applause thinned as people noticed the shaved side of my head, the careful way I moved, the folder in my hand. Every step to the stage felt longer than the last. Jason held out the microphone, and as I took it, he leaned in and whispered, "Don't be stupid." I smiled at him, then turned to the room. "Thank you, Jason. You're right. I have learned a lot about resilience." A few people chuckled softly, expecting warmth. "I learned it when I bought an abandoned warehouse 12 years ago and built it into Harbor Kiln with my own money, my own hands, and every ounce of strength I had." Jason's smile stiffened. "I learned it again 7 weeks ago when I woke up from emergency brain surgery and discovered that while I was unconscious, my family had used a forged medical power of attorney to transfer that building to a buyer." The silence was instant and absolute. My mother made a small choking sound. My father stood. "Eliza, stop this right now." I looked at him. "No, you had your chance to speak when you left me that voicemail." I pulled the first document from the folder and held it up. This is the power of attorney. This is not my signature. The witness is my father's friend. The notary stamp is invalid. And the money from that transfer was used to fund this event and Jason's campaign launch. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Phones lifted. A reporter in the second row stood halfway from his chair. Jason lunged toward the microphone, but Marina was already on her feet, moving with calm precision. She took a second microphone from a stunned event coordinator and said, "My name is Marina Val. I represent Eliza Hart. The documents she is referencing have been reviewed, and a formal fraud complaint is being prepared." Jason's campaign manager, Tessa, stared at him as if she had just watched his face rearrange into a stranger's. "Tell me that isn't true," she said. Jason opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then I pulled out the final document. And since my parents believe so deeply in family sacrifice, I should also explain Seabreeze Lane. My mother went white. "Eliza, please." 5 years ago, when my parents were about to lose their waterfront house because Jason convinced them to invest in a fake boat rental company, someone bought the mortgage debt and let them stay. They thought it was an investment company called Gray Lantern Holdings. I let the room breathe in the truth before I delivered the rest. That company is mine. I own the house. I have owned it for 5 years. Their lease expires in 2 days, and it will not be renewed. The room exploded. Chairs scraped, voices rose, cameras flashed. My father shouted that I was lying, but Marina calmly lifted the ownership records. Jason yelled that I had destroyed him, but Tessa removed her campaign badge and placed it on the podium. "I resign," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. That was the moment the mask fell completely. Donors began walking out. Reporters surrounded the stage. My mother sat frozen, crying silently now, not for me, never for me, but for the life she had lost control of. Jason stood beneath his enormous banner, his perfect future collapsing around him in real time. I set the microphone down carefully because my hands were finally starting to shake. Then I walked off the stage. No one stopped me. Outside, the river was black and silver under the moon, moving steadily past the glass walls, past the shouting, past the wreckage of my family's lies. I sat on a bench, touched the scar above my ear, and breathed through the pain until Marina came out and sat beside me. "It's done," she said. I looked back at the glowing hall, where the people who had called me selfish were now learning exactly what I had survived. "No," I said softly. "Now it begins." The morning after the gala, I woke up to more messages than I had received after brain surgery, which told me everything I needed to know about my family and the town they had spent years performing for. My phone buzzed until I turned it face down on the nightstand. Some messages were apologies from relatives who had called me jealous 2 days earlier. Some were from people who wanted details because gossip tastes better when it comes straight from the wound. A few were from reporters, including one who wrote, "Eliza, the public deserves to know whether Jason Hart knowingly used fraudulent funds." I stared at that one for a long time, then deleted it. The public could learn from the documents. I had said what I needed to say. Marina handled the rest. By noon, Jason had suspended his campaign to focus on family matters, which would have been funny if the word family hadn't started to sound like a threat. By the end of the week, he withdrew completely. Tessa, his campaign manager, handed over records showing fake small-dollar donations, double-billed vendors, and transfers that had no legitimate explanation. The man who had stood beneath chandeliers promising transparency had built his entire campaign on lies, and my stolen studio was only the brightest match in the fire. My father called me 11 times that first day. I answered on the 12th because Marina was sitting beside me and nodded that it was fine as long as I didn't let him pull me into emotion. He didn't ask about my head. He didn't ask if I was recovering. He said, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice shook, not with remorse but rage. I looked out the window of my recovery apartment at the gray Oregon rain sliding down the glass. "Yes," I said. "I told the truth." He called me ungrateful, vicious, unstable, cruel. He said I had destroyed Jason's future, humiliated my mother, ruined his reputation, and turned the town against them. I waited until he ran out of breath, then said, "You sold my studio while I was unconscious after brain surgery." There was silence. Not apology, Just the silence of a man who had no answer and hated me for making him face the question. The next day, my parents received formal notice that their lease on Seabreeze Lane would not be renewed. My mother sent one text, "How could you do this to us?" I typed 3 different replies and deleted them all. Finally, I wrote, "I learned from you that family assets can be transferred when convenient." Then I blocked her number for the afternoon because my doctor said I needed rest. And for once in my life, I decided my body mattered more than their crisis. The fight for Harbor Kiln took 3 months. The buyer claimed innocence at first, but Marina found emails proving they had been warned about irregularities and rushed anyway because the price was far below market value. The court froze the remaining funds, invalidated the transfer, and returned legal ownership to me. When I finally walked back into my studio, the blue front door was scratched. One kiln had been cracked during improper moving, and half my finished inventory was gone. Dust covered the wheels. A bowl I had thrown the week before surgery sat collapsed on a shelf, dried beyond saving, its rim warped like a mouth that had tried to speak and failed. I stood in the middle of that room and expected to feel triumph. Instead, I cried so hard I had to sit on the concrete floor. Not because I had lost the fight, but because winning did not give me back the woman I had been before. It did not give me back the illusion that my parents could still become kinder people. It did not give me back the years I spent confusing usefulness with love. Marina found me there 20 minutes later and sat beside me without saying a word. Eventually, I wiped my face and said, "I thought getting it back would fix everything." She looked around the studio at the shelves and wheels and rain-streaked windows. "No," she said gently. "It just gives you somewhere safe to heal." My parents moved out of Seabreeze Lane 2 weeks later. They left scratches on the floors, old boxes in the garage, and a bitter handwritten note from my father on the kitchen counter that said, "We hope this was worth it." I folded it once, placed it in my pocket, and later used it to start the first fire in the studio's repaired outdoor kiln. Jason left town before summer. Last I heard, he was in Phoenix selling luxury watches online and telling people he had been betrayed by a jealous sister. Maybe he believes that. Maybe believing lies is the only talent he ever truly had. My mother joined a church group and tells people she lost her daughter to anger. I used to imagine confronting her, forcing her to say the words I needed. "I stole from you. I failed you. You deserve better." But some doors stay closed because there is nothing behind them except the same empty room. 6 months after the gala, I reopened Harbor Kiln with 8 students, fresh clay, and rain tapping softly against the windows. My hair had grown back unevenly around the scar, and I no longer tried to hide it. During that first class, a teenage girl asked if broken clay could ever be used again. I showed her how scraps could be softened, wedged, reshaped, and made into something new, but only if you stopped pretending it was still the original piece. As I said it, I realized I was talking about myself. I am 38 now. I own Harbor Kiln. I own the story my family tried to rewrite. I still have days when my head aches and my heart follows. But every morning, I unlock the blue door, turn on the lights, and breathe in clay, rain, and freedom. I learned that boundaries do not destroy families. They reveal what was already broken. I learned that love without respect is just control dressed in nicer clothes. And I learned that when people set your life on fire and then call you cruel for stepping out of the flames, you don't owe them warmth. You owe yourself survival. Thank you so much for listening until the very end. If Eliza's story touched you, shocked you, or reminded you of something you've been through, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next dramatic story. Take care of yourself, protect your peace, and I'll see you in the next story.